Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Unscripted History, where today I will be going over the Judicate of Arborea. Now, this is another kind of stepping stone in the history of Sardinia, so I just kind of get into it. So, I just kind of explain how the Judicate of Arborea came to be. So, until the 9th century, Sardinia was under the control of the Byzantine Empire. However, ultimately, due to the influence of the Barbary pirates and Arabic pirates, it ultimately ended up lessening its control over Sardinia, which led to the formation of Judicati. Now, these Judicati ultimately ended up forming into an archonate, until ultimately the archonate dissolved into 4 separate Judicati, and the one we'll be going over today is the Judicati of Arborea. So, the Judicate of Arborea ultimately started its history around the first judge was Marianus IV. No, not Marianus IV, Marianus I, and he started his rule in 1060. Now he reigned until 1070, when he was ultimately succeeded by Ursulcore I. And with this, the only major thing that Ursulcore did was that he changed the capital from Tharos, which was heavily impacted by pirates at the time, to Oristano. And Oristano obviously was more well defended and less affected by the pirates. So, after that, we then get into the rule of Constantine I, who didn't really do too much. He did see to the, well, not he necessarily, but before his reign, actually, we see as the Judicate of Arborea is ultimately recognized by Pope Gregory II. He's like, yo, you know what? Yo, people to the west over there, y'all pretty chill. Want to join Roman Catholicism? And they were like, sure. So they started to do this, and we see as there was a bit of a squabble over the type of monks during the reign of Constantine I that Sardinia hosted. However, this really led to nothing big. And we see as his son, I believe, his successor, Camita II, ultimately comes to power, and he is not a big fan of what Pope Innocent II does. Now, what Pope Innocent II does is he divides the lands of Sardinia amongst the 2 seas, which are kind of like holy kingdoms. But yeah, the seas which he divides amongst is ultimately Pisa and Genoa. He's dividing up the area, and ultimately he ends up giving the island of Sardinia to Pisa. And now, like I said, Comita II is not a big fan of this, so in 1133, ultimately, he starts going against this precedent set by Innocent II, and he wages a civil war, siding with Genoa to help fight the Pisans off of Sardinia. However, this ultimately does not end up going super well for him, and in 1145, he is excommunicated by Archbishop Baldwin of Pisa, and he is then obviously excommunicated, sent out, and poof, he's gone. So then we see, as his successor, Barrison II ultimately comes to power. And Barrison, he does pretty well for himself, nothing crazy, but ultimately he ends up paying the Holy Roman Emperor to be recognized as King of Sardinia, which he gets the title for a year, but ultimately the Holy Roman Emperor then revokes it from him. But he continues to kind of dub himself this for the rest of his reign. But ultimately, he didn't do anything major, but what he did do is rule the kingdom poorly enough, or not necessarily pick a good successor, which led to civil war, multiple years of civil war. And we see as Peter I and Hugh I are fighting about this, but ultimately Hugh's line does end up coming out on top on Sardinia with the Treaty of Oristano in 1192. And then we see as this line begins to prosper. So first we see Peter II, who was kind of a failure. He didn't do much for his country, but then Marianus II comes up. And Marianus II did a lot. He ended up seeing as the Judicate of Arborea ultimately ended up ruling a majority of the islands of Sardinia for a time. And then it only continues to get better from here with this group. So after that, we then see as Hugh II ultimately ends up coming to power. Now, Hugh II is a big player because, we do, like I said, see Hugh II come to power, and Hugh II is a very good player because we see as he ultimately ends up joining with the crown of Aragon to essentially liberate the island of Sardinia from Pisan and Genoan control. And so we see as, like I said, he joins up with James II of Aragon. And with this, he ultimately, like I said, ends up sweeping him out from 1323 to 1324. He ends up doing very good for himself and all of that. And ultimately, Hugh II is succeeded by his son, who is named, Peter III. Yeah, Peter III. And with that, like I said, we see Peter III, he ultimately ends up reigning for a very short amount of time. I believe he dies in 1348. And then we see in 1353 as Marianus IV comes to power, who was the older brother, well, not the older brother, but the brother of Hugh II. So Marianus IV is actually the only leader throughout all or the only judge throughout the entire Judicate of Arborea, or early Kingdom of Sardinia, whatever you want to refer to it as, who was known as the Great. Marianus IV was known as the Great because of how much success he had in his military campaigns against the Aragonese. Because though he was raised amongst the Aragonese nobility, he was educated with them. I mean, obviously his brother was good enough friends with James II to go warring with him across the island of Sardinia. So we see as they have a close connection. However, Marianus the Great does not. What he ultimately ends up doing is he then kind of rebels against the Aragonese crown and ultimately ends up conquering the entire island of Sardinia, besides the cities of Cagliari, Alghero, and Sassari. Yeah, Sassari is the name of it, which was under the control of this character by the name of Brancaleone. What was his last name? Brancaleone something. You gotta remember Brancaleone. So we then see as ultimately Marianus does end up dying ultimately, which then leads to the rise of, who was it next? Hugh III. Yeah, next is Hugh III. And once Hugh III comes to power, he ultimately doesn't end up doing too much. He does expand upon the actions of Marianus IV not necessarily quite a bit, but trying to establish him, solidifying him. But then he ends up dying without a successor, which leads to ultimately 1381. Or like I said, dies without a successor. And then we see as it tries, well, at least the Kingdom of Sardinia, the Judicate of Arborea, attempts to shape itself into a republic. However, this ultimately does end up failing because we see Eleanor de Serabas ultimately ends up coming to power. Now, she was the sister... She wasn't the sister of Marianus IV. She was the sister of Hugh III, yeah. And so she ends up coming in 1387 and acting as regent for her sons. I believe his name was Frederick, and the other one was Marianus V. And so we see as ultimately she ends up coming in, rules for a little while, and she ultimately, I believe, ended up ruling until she died in 1404. Then her son, Marianus V, ultimately ended up coming to power, but he died very early on in his reign. He died in 1407. And then we see as William III of Narbonne ends up coming to power, which I mentioned in my first Sardinian history video. And with this, we see as he is now facing off against the Aragonese once more, because they've been kind of fighting with them throughout this entire thing, because obviously the Aragonese were betrayed by Marianus IV and all of that. And so there's been continuous warfare throughout all of this. And we see as William III of Narbonne ultimately ends up inheriting this warfare. And it is not in a very good predicament. So we see as Martin of Aragon and Martin I of Sicily, who is his son, ultimately end up kind of beating the island of Sardinia down. They see they've beaten the Judicate of Arborea down pretty heavily. But we do see as there's a bit of a change of pace after the Battle of Senluri, which happened on June 30th, 1409, which did lead to the vanquishing of the Judicate of Arborea and stuff like that. However, we see also as Martin I dies in this battle, or he dies suddenly. And so with this, there is this new ability to reclaim some of the lands which were lost. And we see as the Arboreans start to make a little bit of gains. They're able to gain back some parts. They are able once more to acquire. Also, I know that I forgot to mention this a little bit, but Eleonora de Serabas was actually married to the Brancaleone dude. So yeah, the one who had held the lands away from Marianus IV for a time, but he was a Doria. Yeah, that was his last name, Doria. So that is kind of one of the feuding houses on the island of Sardinia, so that's why he didn't give the island up to Marianus IV. But yeah, so also the William III of Narbonne was the son of Beatrice, who was Eleanor de Serabas's sister. So I presume either not the sister, or at least the full sister or half sister of Hugh III. But yeah, so with this, like I said, we see as this warfare continues, and ultimately they're able to gain a little bit more land back. But ultimately, the Aragonese, with a new and more powerful, more souped-up force, are ultimately able to beat the Arboreans down, until ultimately in March of 1410, Oristano is captured, and the Arboreans are essentially completely kaput. So, after this, we see as everything starts to play out, and we see then as Alfonso V of Spain, or of Aragon, ultimately ends up coming to the leaders of Arborea, and he's like, you know what, I'll pay you 100,000 florins for just all the titles and all that officially. So he ends up paying him 100,000 florins, and the Judicate of Arborea essentially comes to a conclusion here in 1420. But we do see as there is still a bit of a remnant. So we see as this dude by the name of Leonardo, who was the governor of Sardinia under the Aragonese, ultimately ends up putting up an offensive in 1470 and claiming himself to be king of Sardinia and essentially another judge of Arborea. However, this is quelled pretty swiftly in 1487 at the Battle of Macomera is kind of essentially where it ends, and that really indicates the ending point of Arborean independence and autonomy. So yeah, that is kind of the history of the, I guess, nation of Arborea, the Judicate of Arborea. I also forgot to mention in, I believe it was 1145, after the excommunication of Comita, we saw as Logudoro was given the lands of Sardinia for a time because of Comita getting excommunicated and essentially kind of nullifying the power of the Judicate of Arborea. However, we then see, obviously, with the rise of Barristan II, that is a little bit more reinstated and more stabilized as a nation. But yeah, so that just really interested me. I've been wanting to go over that one for a bit. I really was kind of nervous about discussing it in a video because I was like, dang, this is a lot of stuff to remember. So I hope I did it justice. And obviously, like I said, this is unscripted, but all the dates and the years I have memorized up in my noggin. So you can obviously go and check those. I just did some very brief reading. I love going to Wikipedia. That's my thing. And just researched the kingdom of, not the kingdom, but the Judicate of Arborea because it's super interesting to me. And I just love learning about stuff that I haven't learned about in my good old God-fearing, freedom-loving, red-blooded American schools. But yeah, so that's all there really is for the, I guess, essentially entire history of the Judicate of Arborea. And yeah, that's all I really have for this episode of Unscripted History. So thank you very much for watching. All right, sorry about the post-credit scene, but I had to do a little bit of post-production here because I actually did get one of the years wrong. My noggin didn't properly remember, like I said. So Hugh III actually died in 1383 rather than 1381, like I said. But yeah, so I just wanted to correct that and get all that straight so no one, I guess, got misled. Though it doesn't make much of a difference because, I mean, it still ended up leading to the Republic with Eleanor de Sarabas and everything that followed it. So yeah, sorry for the mistake, and thank you very much.